They coat your toast in the morning, they lather in your shower, they fry your dinner, they soften your lipstick, they melt into your chocolate. You touch this ingredient dozens of times a day, and you almost certainly do not know its name. It's palm oil, and its story begins nowhere near the plantations you've seen in the news. It begins in a forest on the west coast of Africa, where a tree evolved that would eventually feed the modern world and burn its rainforest to the ground. Here's the question worth carrying for the next 10 minutes. How did a plant that fed West African villages for thousands of years end up as the single biggest driver of tropical deforestation on a continent thousands of miles away? Not one of the drivers, the biggest. And how did the people whose ancestors first cultivated it end up buying it back, more than a century later, from someone else's plantations? The answer runs through Egyptian tombs, Liverpool soap factories, 4 seedlings smuggled to a botanical garden in Java, a Belgian king's private colony, and a supermarket aisle you've probably walked down this week. The tree is called Elaeus guineensis, as in the Gulf of Guinea, the coastline that curls from present-day Ivory Coast down through Nigeria and into Cameroon. That is home. That is where it grew wild in dense natural groves for tens of thousands of years before anyone tried to sell it. For the peoples of that coast, the Yoruba, the Igbo, the Efik, the Fon, the oil palm was not a crop in the modern sense. It was a companion species. It offered them cooking oil pressed from the fruit, palm wine tapped from the trunk, thatching from the fronds, medicine from the bark, kernels for lamp fuel, soap from the ashes. A single tree gave food, light, drink, shelter, and remedy. There is no equivalent plant in European agriculture. Nothing quite comes close. Picture what this looked like. A village of maybe 200 people sitting inside a grove that grew itself, palms tall as houses, fronds arching overhead, bunches of orange-red fruit hanging in clusters heavier than a small child. Twice a year, men would climb the trunks with woven belts to cut the ripe bunches down. Women would boil the fruit for hours in iron pots, pounding out the deep red oil, straining it, storing it in gourds. The kernels, the hard pits inside the fruit, would be cracked separately, sometimes months later, for a paler oil used in lamps and cosmetics. Almost nothing was wasted. The fibrous shell of the fruit went into the cooking fire. The empty bunches went into the compost. The palm sap, tapped from a hole cut just below the crown, fermented into a slightly sweet wine within a day. And people knew this, long before Europeans knew. In the late 1800s, archaeologists working in the ancient Egyptian town of Abydos opened a burial site and found several kilograms of a solid, waxy substance still holding the shape of the vessel that had contained it. When it was analyzed decades later, the chemistry pointed strongly to palm oil, aged and partially oxidized over 5,000 years. If that identification holds, and some scholars still debate it, it means somebody had already carried palm oil across the Sahara before the pyramids at Giza were finished. Traders, over 2,000 miles of desert, moving oil that could only have come from a tree that only grew on the coast of West Africa. That is how deep this plant story runs. But the story you likely know, the one about Borneo orangutans and burning peatlands, does not start in Africa at all. It starts in a much stranger place. It starts in a Dutch botanical garden. In 1848, a shipment arrived at the Bogor Botanic Gardens on the island of Java, in what was then the Dutch East Indies. 4 seeds of Elaeus guineensis, originating in West Africa, routed through Amsterdam. 2 of the seeds came directly. 2 came via the islands of Mauritius, or Reunion, in the Indian Ocean. The head gardener at Bogor, a Dutchman named Johannes Elias Teitzman, planted them next to the garden path. Ornamental, a curiosity, a gift. Those 4 seedlings would produce every commercial oil palm in Southeast Asia, every single one. The plantations in Sumatra and Sabah and Sarawak and Kalimantan trace them back far enough, follow the genetics all the way down, and you land at 4 trees in a colonial garden. For roughly half a century, they sat there being decorative. Nobody planted more. Nobody thought there was money in them. because in Europe the palm oil market was still being fed from Africa, and it was growing at a pace no one could quite explain. Here is what changed. In the mid-1800s, the Industrial Revolution began to demand fat, enormous, unprecedented quantities of fat. Not for eating, for machines. Locomotive wheels needed grease. Textile mills needed lubricant. Tin cans needed a coating. Street lamps and candles needed a base. And soap? Cheap, hard, molded bar soap for a newly urban working class that had discovered it could bathe more than once a month. Needed a vegetable fat that stayed solid at room temperature and lathered when it hit warm water. Palm oil did all of it. It arrived in the ports of Liverpool and Marseille in barrels stamped from Lagos, from Calabar, from Whydah. Its price collapsed as the volume climbed. By the 1880s, Britain alone was importing tens of thousands of tons a year, and most of it was going into a single product line, bar soap. You've heard the name Lever, probably. William Hesketh Lever, the man who built the empire we now call Unilever, built it on a soap called Sunlight. And Sunlight was made primarily of West African palm oil. That soap changed hygiene in Europe. Ordinary families that had never owned a bar of anything now had one on the kitchen shelf. Hand washing spread. Laundry got cleaner, disease rates began to drop. In its own small way, palm oil helped write the sanitary revolution of the late 19th century. Lever built an entire model village in northwest England to make his soap. He called it Port Sunlight. Neat brick cottages, gardens, schools, a hospital, a library, an art gallery. He liked to describe himself as an enlightened capitalist, and by the standards of Victorian industry, he was. His British workers had housing conditions that most factory laborers could only dream of. Foreign visitors came to Merseyside just to walk through the tidy little streets. The image was pristine. The palm oil was not. And here is where the story turns. Because that same demand, that endless, mechanized, industrial appetite for fat, began to reshape the African coast. Not gently, not by trade, by force. King Leopold II of Belgium had claimed the Congo Basin as personal property in 1885. Textbooks remember his regime for rubber, for the villages punished when they failed to meet quotas, for the severed hands, for what one witness called the rubber terror. What textbooks skip is what came after rubber. When the rubber boom faded, the same coercive system was turned toward palm. Belgian and British companies negotiated exclusive concessions covering vast tracts of Congolese forest. Villages that had grown and pressed oil for their own use for 1,000 years were suddenly told they now owed a quota to a company they had never heard of. In 1911, William Lever himself signed a treaty with the Belgian colonial government. His new subsidiary, called Huileries du Congo Belge, received a concession of 750,000 hectares of Congolese palm forest. 750,000 hectares, larger than the entire country of Cyprus, roughly a quarter of the surface area of Belgium itself, handed to a British soap maker so that Liverpool factories could keep humming. The company struggled to find willing workers. Local people who owned their own palm groves saw no reason to work as wage laborers for a fraction of what their own harvest could earn. So Lever's company leaned on the Belgian colonial authorities to compel them. Police stations went up around the concessions. A monopoly was granted. Villagers who sold palm nuts from their own groves to anyone other than the company could now be prosecuted as thieves. Historians who have gone through the Belgian archives have documented mortality rates on the plantations so severe that, in some recruitment cohorts, only half the workers ever returned home. The Belgian historian Jules Marchal, who spent decades combing through the archives of the Lever plantations, would later put it in blunt terms. The humanitarian promises of the concession were, in practice, cover for a forced labor system, whose brutality was well documented at the time and quietly tolerated for decades afterward. Belgian doctors and missionaries who visited the sites wrote letters home describing conditions that shocked them. Some of those letters still sit in the archives, unread until researchers went looking 100 years later. The oil palm, the ancestral tree of the West African village, had become an instrument of empire, And still, the demand kept climbing, which brings us back to those 4 trees in Java. By the early 1900s, colonial planters in Southeast Asia were watching African production and doing the math. Sumatra had cheap land. It had a Dutch colonial administration eager to develop plantations. It had a labor force that could be recruited, or more honestly, coerced, from Java and southern India. And it had 4 fully mature oil palms in the Bogor Gardens that had begun producing viable seed. In 1905, a Belgian agricultural engineer named Adrian Hallett arrived in Sumatra. Hallett had spent years working on palm plantations in the Congo, so he knew the plant. Walking through the tobacco estates near Delhi, where the Bogor palm's descendants had been planted as decorative avenues, he noticed something. The Sumatran palms were bearing fruit faster than any tree he had seen in Africa. Fatter fruit, richer flesh. Something about the volcanic soil, the equatorial rainfall, the total absence of the pests and diseases the tree had co-evolved with in West Africa, had made these transplants outperform their ancestors. By 1911, Hallett had set up the first industrial-scale oil palm plantation in Southeast Asia, then another, then dozens. By the 1930s, the Dutch East Indies was producing more palm oil than any single country in West Africa. Here's the revelation. This is the part almost nobody knows. The rise of Southeast Asian palm oil did not simply add supply to a growing global market, it replaced Africa. By the mid-20th century, the coastline, where the oil palm evolved, where villages had pressed its fruit for millennia, where the entire industry had begun, had been reduced to a marginal producer. The plant left home, and the money followed it. Independence in the 1960s did not reverse this. African oil palm production stagnated. Nigeria, which had been the world's largest exporter of palm oil at the start of the 20th century, became a net importer by the 1980s. A country whose villages had pressed this oil for over 1,000 years now bought it back from Malaysian conglomerates in the very ports its grandparents had used to ship it out. That is the first half of the revelation. The plant was taken. Here's the second half. Once Southeast Asia had the plant and the market and the plantation infrastructure, it needed something else. Land. Vast, cheap, ecologically stable land, close to the equator where oil palms would grow best. Indonesia and Malaysia had exactly that. Sitting under some of the oldest, densest, most biodiverse rainforest on Earth. You already know what happens next in outline, but the numbers are worth sitting with. Between 1990 and 2015, Indonesia lost roughly a quarter of its primary rainforest. Not all of that was palm oil, but palm oil was the single biggest driver. In Borneo alone, oil palm plantations expanded from a few 100,000 hectares in the early 1990s to more than 8 million hectares today. To picture that, imagine a monoculture plantation the size of Portugal, then imagine cutting down the rainforest to plant it. Then imagine doing that inside the span of a single human generation. Orangutan populations on Sumatra and Borneo collapsed. In some regions, half of all wild orangutans disappeared inside a couple of decades, the fastest documented decline of any great ape in recorded history. Tigers, elephants, and rhinos vanished from ranges they had held for centuries. Whole ecosystems that had taken 60 million years to assemble were erased in the time it took a child to grow up. Peatlands, swampy forests whose waterlogged soils store enormous amounts of ancient carbon, laid down over thousands of years, were drained with canals, then set on fire to clear the land for planting. Peat, once dried, burns underground. It smolders for months. During major fire years, the smoke from Indonesian peat fires has released so much carbon dioxide that the country's daily emissions have briefly overtaken those of the entire United States. A haze thick enough to close airports in Singapore, in Kuala Lumpur, and Bangkok has drifted halfway across the region and lasted for weeks. Children in 3 countries stayed home from school. Ships lost their way in the Strait of Malacca, all of it ultimately, so that palm oil could enter a supply chain that would end on a shelf in Berlin or Sao Paulo or Chicago. Today, Indonesia and Malaysia together produce roughly 85% of the world's palm oil. Global production has climbed to somewhere north of 75 million tons per year. And here is the closing turn. Palm oil is now in roughly half of the packaged products in your local supermarket. Half. That statistic gets repeated a lot, but it's worth breaking down what it actually means. It's in your bread, your instant noodles, your chocolate spread, your ice cream, your margarine, your biscuits, your shampoo, your lipstick, your soap. The same soap William Lever built his empire on, 140 years later, made of the same oil, still driving the same clearance of forest, just on the other side of the world. The average person in a country like Germany or the United States eats or applies palm oil somewhere between 6 and 8 kilograms per year. Most of them have no idea, because on the label it hides. It shows up as vegetable oil, as sodium palmitate, as glyceryl stearate, as sodium lauryl sulfate, as stearic acid, as 100 quiet chemical names that mean, at their root, oil pressed from an African tree on a plantation carved out of an Indonesian forest to lather in your morning shower. That is the full arc. A crop the Yoruba grew for 1,000 years. A soap that helped bring hygiene to industrial Europe. A concession that helped destroy villages in the Congo. 4 seedlings in a colonial garden. A rainforest cleared to feed a shampoo aisle. So, knowing all of this, what actually changes for you? Probably not a boycott. And this is the part where honest environmentalists tend to become quiet because the arithmetic is uncomfortable. Palm oil is so embedded in the global food and cosmetics supply that most alternatives, soybean, coconut, sunflower, rapeseed, actually require more land per ton of oil than palm does. In some cases, 4 to 9 times more land. Replacing palm oil with another vegetable oil, without also reducing total demand, tends to move the deforestation problem rather than solve it. Drive palm out of your kitchen, and unless you've reduced how much oil and fat you're consuming, you may simply be pushing bulldozers into Argentine soy country or Ukrainian sunflower fields. What does change is your ability to read. Look at the back of a product this week. Ingredients written in Latinate chemistry, palmitate, stearate, glycerol, laureth, are almost always palm-derived. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. It's in your kitchen cupboards. It's in your bathroom shelves. It's in your snack drawer. From there, the small decisions get real. Certified sustainable palm oil, the RSPO label, imperfect and criticized as it is, remains the most credible independent standard on offer, and consistently choosing brands committed to it applies quiet, cumulative pressure across an entire supply chain. Emailing your favorite chocolate brand, your favorite noodle brand, your favorite cosmetics company to ask what their sourcing policy is does more over time than any private boycott can. And here is the thing that took the longest for me to sit with. The story of palm oil is not a story about a bad plant. It is a story about what happens when the ecological knowledge of a people is stripped from them, industrialized somewhere else, and returned to the world as a commodity they no longer control. That is a pattern. Palm oil is one instance of it. Rubber is another. Cinchona, the source of quinine, is another. Once you see it, you start to see it everywhere. So the next time you butter your toast, or wash your hands, or unwrap a chocolate bar, you are touching the final stage of a journey that began 5,000 years ago on the coast of West Africa. An oil that fed villages became an oil that lit lamps, became an oil that greased locomotives, became an oil that cleaned imperial hands, became an oil that now hides quietly in almost everything you put on your body or in your mouth. 4 palm seedlings in a botanical garden in Java in 1848. Nobody watching them thought they were watching the future. They were. The oil palm went abroad, made a fortune, and never really came home. And the forests that raised it and the forests that now feed it both paid the price. You know the name now. Elaeus guineensis. Guinea, as in the coast. The one place on the whole map of the world this whole story began. Once you see it on a label, in a soap dish, on a spoon, it looks a little different. That is not a small thing. That is the beginning of every honest conversation this century is going to have about where our comfort comes from and about who paid for it before we did.